Hello, 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 and welcome to the CDFM study group. I am Helen Thomas. All right, today's session, we're going to be covering CDFM Module 1, Competency 2, Defense Manpower Management. There will be no slides. You will just be listening to me, so that's why we need the interaction where I'm going to ask you questions, you provide feedback, and then that way I know for those that are on the live sessions, if you understand what we are discussing. The main reason there's no, you have to, if you don't have the newer study guides, then it'll be difficult. So I won't even go through page numbers like I normally would do. But if you do have the newer books, I'm starting on page 99 for the 2024 Module 1 Participant Guide. When you're studying for the CDFM, you have to dedicate time to sit down and focus on that material, because everything will distract you. Even just sitting here listening to me, if you've never looked over this information, after a while, you're going to be like, what is she talking about? Is you have to read through the material before you come, or at least have a working knowledge of the topics. All right, then. Those are the preliminaries. If you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube page, please go ahead and subscribe. Again, the more people that subscribe, the more people that click like, share, leave a comment, have activity on the channel, the YouTube platform will promote the videos for other people to find it as they're studying for their CDFL. All right. So manpower management. So we talked about history. We talked about the Constitution is the baseline for everything that we do within our federal government, within our Congress. We talked about two bodies of Congress, the House and the Senate, and their importance. We talked about Article 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution that governs the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. We also looked at the functions of Congress and all the things that they are allowed to do. We looked at make the laws, the executive branch executes the laws, and the judicial branch will interpret the laws. We didn't touch as much on executive orders, since we have a lot of that in the news right now. As we talked about the Article 2 and the executive powers, I wanted to start there to make sure that we understand that the typical bill, which is that general proposal, will go through Congress and so forth for approval, goes to the president for the president to sign. Whereas an executive order, the president can just sign it once they put it together. He has that executive power. However, even though the bill did not go through Congress, that executive order still carries the same weight, or it has the same guideline as the bill, as a law. So it's still subject to judicial review. So all the executive orders that you see or hear about, they do go into law. They got to be put into action, but those are not laws in a sense of a bill turning into a law. So I just wanted to put that out there. All right. So in manpower management, everything boils back down to funding. So we're going to explore the function of financial management in the planning, programming, budgeting, execution. That's the resource process that is used. We're going to look at how, once we determine what type of threat the country faces, then we have to figure out how we're going to pay for things. So in the planning, estimating costs and personnel, because you got to have the people to do the work. And mobilizing, how many forces do we need? Do we have the funding? So those are all different questions that goes through when they're trying to manage the number of personnel, whether in uniform or in the civilian or contractor arena. So the mission of the Department of Defense is, that's what it is, to defend, right? So they have to provide the forces needed to protect not just us, but also to protect influence those abroad. So since I always hear people like, well, why we got to help other countries? What are your take on why the United States determines or helps other countries? Why do we do that? And if you have a military background for strategy, then that should be an easy question for you. Think about it. Why does the Department of Defense have that, not just to protect for our security, but we also have a mission to sustain our influence abroad? What is the purpose of that? Anybody can chime in. All right. You're going to make me call name? Let me see who's got a picture out there. All right, Mr. Lincoln.
Um, is it a part of our national defense strategy?
Okay,
Um,
it's part of our strategy, but my question is why? Why aren't we just protecting ourselves? Which a lot of Americans, if you listen to people as the government is doing certain things and assisting different countries, we have a lot to say about it. And I hear it a lot while I'm walking in the store or something. Why we got to help this country? Or why we got to help? Why do we even intervene and assist in keeping peace in the other countries? Okay, think along that line. Eunice, you know I'm going to come to you, right? My go-to. Oh, she's on hold. All right, Mr. Jones, what are your thoughts?
Can you repeat your question again?
Yes, sir. So I said the mission of the Department of Defense is to provide forces to deter war and provide for our security of the United States, for our security, and also to sustain our influence abroad. Why is it important for us to sustain our influence abroad? Why do we intervene? Why do we try to keep peace abroad? And it's not a military statistical, because the success on the CDFM is for you to be able to think outside of the book.
Outside. Yeah, think
right?
outside what the actual answer is.
Right, because they're not going to come and say and ask you questions directly. It's going to be a scenario. So understanding that if we don't as a country assist other countries to maintain peace, eventually that trouble is going to come in your back door. If you look at it in a simplified manner, meaning just like when you have 9/11, those things happen if we kind of stay off, hands off, and nope, we're not going to get involved. Once those individuals or the strategy, once they start taking control of different entities and growing in power, then eventually, if we are the powerhouse of the nation, then they're going to look, okay, well, it's time to look at the United States. So it's important as the Department of Defense to get involved. So within the Department of Defense, there are 3 military departments. They are Army, Navy, Air Force. So listen to the words. Military departments, there's only 3. But armed services, there is 5. 2 different words. So military department is Army Department, Navy, Air Force. The 5 armed services is Army, Navy, Air Force. Then you have the Marine Corps and the Space Force, which is that newest force that was started. And I think that's in the 2020 study guide also. So the Marine Corps falls under the Navy and the Space Force falls under the Air Force. Any question on that?
So they don't consider the Coast Guard in any of that as well?
Well, the Coast Guard doesn't fall under the Department of Defense. They fall under the Homeland Security.
Homeland Security.
Right.
Okay.
So we only focusing on what's important to the Department of Defense. And this is a certified defense financial manager exam. So The Coast Guard is still on the side, but they fall under Homeland Security. So we're looking now at the structure of the Department of Defense. 3 military departments, 5 armed services or 5 military forces, 20 defense agencies. Like who could tell me one defense agency out of that 20?
Department of Defense.
Well, falling under Department of Defense.
Homeland Security.
Department.
Okay. Stay under the Department of Defense structure. All right, what is
Department
your
Army?
commissary? No, not that. Yeah, that's one. But what is their commissary? When you're talking defense agencies, that's agencies. DECA, right? And what's that D stands for? Defense. Right? So I think defense contracting. So that's another sub agency under defense. So they're different agencies under Department of Defense, but there are 20 of them. It didn't ask which ones, but know that since most people are familiar with the commissaries, your commissary is a defense agency. Another big defense agency, DFAS, right? Where they do the financial management. So DFAS is a defense agency, just to give you examples. All right, so what's the purpose of the military? The purpose of the military is to man, equip, and train the forces. We say the Department of Defense, their mission is to go to war, protect, provide security. Well, we need to train our folks. We need to put people in those positions. So that is why we have the military, responsible for manning, equipping, and training the force. And I think I touched on what I'm about to say last week, but operational chain of command, like you have all these installations, you have the structure, you have the president, you have the Secretary of Defense, you have Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those should be familiar terms with you. So understand when it comes to funding, you have to know that the operational chain of command of those forces, that NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, they are responsible and they have operational control of those areas. So funding, manpower management is focused on supplying the requirements of those commands. So operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense to those combatant commanders. And everyone familiar, right? You're either in a NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, AFRICOM, wherever you work, you're in one of those combatant command areas. So resources when it comes to funding and manpower, equipment, depending on the needs of those combatant commands and whatever the nation's priority is for that year, that fiscal year, that is how the resources will be funneled. So the definition of manpower management is a process used to determine the right mix of personnel that we can get under certain budgetary guidance to be able to accomplish the defense mission. So just think about it in that sense. I got a job I have to do, but I need resources to do it. And so manpower is the management, is the process that they use to, once you come up with the plan for the country, now you need to get the resources to accomplish that plan. So there are a few terms that you have to be familiar with. And this is when you deal with military personnel or your civilian contractor, to know the right mix of personnel that is needed. You need to know the definition of actual strength. That is the number of personnel in the organization or projected to be in the organization at a specific time. Assigned strength. That's the actual number of people assigned to that agency in a whole, sort of the entire service. End strength. You should be familiar with that because your military forces are managed by end strength. The end strength is the number of people authorized or military personnel authorized at the end of that fiscal year. So if they say the military end strength is 40,000, at the end of fiscal year 25, you have to be at 40,000 personnel. So they always, whether it's through attrition, people are retiring, people are getting different jobs, switching, whatever it is that end strength. A term you need to be familiar with because it's actually in all three of the, actually four of the modules of CDFM, including module 4, is the Future Years Defense Program, FYDP, FYDP. That is the official DoD database, and I'm gonna read it as it states, that summarizes projection. Is in order for us to project into the future, we need a systematic process to do so. We need a database to keep track of all these analytical processes that is being conducted. And so the FYDP is that database that summarizes and projects the appropriation, the authorization needed, the programs, because when you go to Congress, you're going to Congress with your POM, Program Objective Memorandum. That's the programs that you want to do or need to do. And then you also go with the budget estimate submission. We're asking for funding. And so FYDP helps the DoD to keep track of those requirements. So typically, the FYDP is completed during the POM phase. So whenever you hear they're doing, we're working on POM, whatever POM for that year, it's in the programming phase. And what you need to understand with the CDFM is whatever process is going on, you need to know who or the title of the person in the DoD that's in charge of that process. The FYDP database is a cost analysis because it's dealing with money. So the DCAPE, the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, is the person that's in charge of the programming phase and also responsible for updating the FYDP database. Let me pause right there and catch your breath. What questions do you have of what I said? FYDP. Okay. So again, FYDP database will come up in all the phases and all the modules because of its importance. So DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, is in charge of the programming phase of PPBE and in charge of updating the future year's defense program. So when the final updates are made for the president's budget in the budgeting phase, then the FYDP is also updated. So they know we have this mission to accomplish. These are the appropriations necessary to accomplish that mission. These are the approved programs, and these are the components that are going to get that job done. As we're talking about manpower management as a whole, the organization that's responsible, or the secretariat that's responsible for manpower guidance, is the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. So USDP&R, Undersecretary of Defense. So if they list the functions of the manpower management, and then they say, all right, of these 4 choices, which or who's responsible for updating manpower or manpower guidance, manpower management. If it starts with ASA, the FMMC, then it's not, that's the Army level. Anything or most 99% other than the DCAPE, the majority of the titles start with Undersecretary of Defense. So a lot of people get confused when they have a multiple choice and they list the titles of that particular individual. If it doesn't start with an Undersecretary of Defense and you know it's not a DCAPE, then it's not a DoD level title. because you can have titles for people who work the same job, but at a different level. So who leads the process for allocating military manpower? So Joint Chiefs of Staff is another group of individuals. And when you get to Module 2, you'll get into these individuals more extensively. As I stated a few minutes ago, your president is a civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian, and then they're in charge of the military. So in order for them to translate from military lingo to military, from civilian lingo to military lingo, they have to have military advisors. And those military advisors are your Joint Chiefs of Staff. You have Army Chief of Staff, Navy Chief of Staff, and so forth. So their job is to speak for the Army, speak for the Navy. Their job is to advise the president, advise the Secretary of Defense on anything military related. So usually before any decision is made with the military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff has to provide their recommendation to the President and the Secretary of Defense. The Joint Chiefs of Staff has a chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And the chairman is the one that is the spokesperson for the group. Just like with any organization, you have a senior person. So each service would then relay their service information to the chairman, and then the chairman will present it forward. So when it comes to allocating manpower, that's why you have your top military folks saying how much or where or what type of mix of personnel is needed for a particular mission. So who leads the process for allocating military manpower? That is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Civilian personnel can only be used in positions that do not mandate military personnel. So do you know of any functions or jobs that only someone in uniform is authorized to perform? Does anybody know of any of those? Or where they allow civilians to take charge of it? I don't know of it too many. But there are some instances. What is it? What's, you say BRB? What's BRB? You want to put it in the chat or speak?
Be right back.
Oh. All right, senior moments. All right, gotcha. All right. So I'll leave that alone then. All right, Title 10 of the U.S. Code. So everything is based on a law. They can either tie it to the Constitution or Title 10, which governs your military forces, your reserve forces. Title 32 deals with your National Guard. And what is the title that governs civilian personnel? Since I see a lot of you are civilian.
Title 5.
Title 5. Those ones you need to know because I see them consistently. So Title 5 is for civilians. Title 32 deals with your National Guard personnel. And Title 10 is for everybody else. So under Title 10, it requires that the end strength of the military be authorized by Congress every year, so annually. So that's why that requirement is there. It's based on a law. Where are all personnel assignments documented? When you assign personnel, is documented in a system or plan called the Global Force Management Allocation Plan. This was new from the older book. I didn't see this in the older books. So the GFM, Global Force Management Allocation Plan. And it is governed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So as I stated earlier, you got to be able to tie the information together because I just caught that earlier. I said, who leads the process for allocating military manpower? And we said it was the Joint Chief of Staff. And then now the same Joint Chief of Staff is the keeper of the Global Force Management Allocation Plan. So you tie those two bits of information together. So what it does, it considers readiness and availability of the force. How quickly can we provide support to those combatant commanders and get the people trained, or the right equipment, transportation, logistic requirements to those combatant commanders. So that, don't forget, the mission of the Department of Defense is we got to get them what they need for them to go and provide that security. So I repeat, first priority for programming manpower goes to combatant commanders based off of guidance from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because operational chain of command runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. And when you're studying for the CDFM, you need to repeat this information as you move along multiple times so that you're able to tie it all together. You cannot treat the information as bits and pieces of information. Does anyone have any question? And no question is a dumb question, because this is your opportunity to ask, and somebody else might have the same question. Or you could type it in the chat if you don't feel like saying it out loud.
I didn't catch the name of it. It was the Global Force
Allocation Plan.
Oh.
Global Force Management, so it's GFM Allocation Plan. So what that plan also does, it applies 3 areas of forces. Because again, they're trying to figure out different courses of action of personnel that they need for that mission, whatever their mission is. So they look at the preferred strength of forces, a contingency source. So let's say we can't get what we want, but let's say we can get 2 or more people added or taken away, a contingency plan, and also execution sourcing based on available asset. Because you always start off up here with your requirements, but then reality will kick in, and then you're gonna say, okay, this is all I can get for individuals that are trained, who can leave right away by the suspense date, and so forth. So manpower resources, just like your funding, is managed through the PPBE process within the Department of Defense. So they use this systematic process to go through planning. We know what the mission is. We know what our strategy is, what we want to do. Now we need to put it into action. And so the DoD uses the PPBE process, planning, where they take all of the sources of documents, national security strategy, national defense strategy. These are terms you're going to have to be familiar with as you continue to study. And then they come up with guidance for the field. They come up with guidance for the POM in the programming phase, the budget phase, and the execution phase. Although this bit of information, what I'm going to say, is not in module 1 directly, it's still important to note, because if you haven't figured out, for those who may have tested before, you're not going to find 100% of what's on the exam right in the book. So it's not like a college class where you can go back and be like, oh, there's the answer. Sometimes the answer for the CDFM could be in a law, and yeah, they expect you to read the Constitution. It could be in an OMB circular. Yes, you're expected. So if it's not directly in the book where you can read it, then the expectation. So that's why you have to 95% know what's going on in the study guides, so you can leave room for the ones where you may have to guess. So let me add, in the PPBE process, as I mentioned a little while, is you need to know who at the DoD is responsible for that process. So let me put this out. I'm updating my notes as I go. So for the PPBE process, the planning phase is the responsibility of the USD for policy. policy. And this is also in module 2. The programming phase is the responsibility of the DCAPE. And what else does the DCAPE update in the programming phase? Does anybody remember? What database do they update?
The FIDEP.
The FIDEP, the Future Years Defense Program. So the DCAPE in programming updates the Future Year Defense Program. In the budgeting phase, the USD Comptroller is in charge of that phase and also the execution phase. USD Comptroller. All right. Any question? Let me pause. Let me put a pin right there. So planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. Planning is handled by the USD for policy, programming by the DCAPE, and the DCAPE also updates the Future Year Defense Program. Budget and execution is the responsibility of the USD for Comptroller, USD Comptroller. All right, got it. Another policy document that you need to be familiar with is OMB Circular A11. So let's break that down a little bit. OMB, we talked about last time, is Office of Management and Budget. And you think of the CDFM as a jigsaw puzzle or just a puzzle, and it's got a bunch of pieces, key players over here, processes, document. And your job on the exam now is to take those pieces and put them in the right spot. So when you have a law, a policy, a directive, a circular, you need to know, okay, where do they fall in the executive branch, legislative, judicial branch? All of those things align for you. So OMB, Office of Management and Budget, is the resource manager that works directly for the president, the CFO for the president. And OMB Circular A11 is important because it comes up also a lot of times in the study guide. It provides guidance for submission of your manpower requirements that is needed to be included in the president's budget. How often is the president's budget submitted and when? How often did we say we said it at the last week or the first part?
So annually?
So it's provided annually when? When does the new budget have to be submitted to Congress?
By February.
February.
First
Right,
Monday.
no later than the first Monday in February. Right, so he has to submit it. So DOD and everybody else has to get their input submitted to OMB in the president's budget. So OMB Circular A11 provides the guidance for them to develop their budget and for them to develop their programs. So we said military personnel are managed by end strength across the fiscal year and is broken down by officer, enlisted, cadets, active duty, reserve, National Guard. Civilian personnel budget estimates are prepared in terms of FTEs, full-time equivalent. So that is how they come up with the manning rates, employments, average, end strength, grade of your personnel benefits. You got to think of all of these extras for your civilian. So the intent of when they start doing the budget formulation, which is the beginning of developing a budget, is when you're thinking of manpower, is to determine, again, the right mix of personnel. We got term, we got permanence, we have contractors versus civilians, we got all of that that's included. So we said that accurately estimate the end strength and the FTEs by going through this budget formulation process. So in the planning phase, what they're looking at is they have a mission, they receive the big op order from their hire, which is the National Security Strategy. Department of Defense comes up with a strategy, and then we go into the planning phase. We know what the mission is, what the priorities are. We can start planning with input from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We can now develop long-range scenarios. They have to be able to, I guess, I don't know if everybody's military background, but it's called war gaming, where you pretend you put scenarios in place like they do on the video, and then you determine, okay, what do we need to be able to accomplish this mission? So all the planning documents is done usually from November of one year till about March of the next. So programming phase, the DCAPE is in charge of this phase, and all requirements are prioritized and allocated into specific programs. When they go to Congress with that budget request, they have to have it broken down by programs in your palms. So whatever it is that they need to request from Congress is allocated into specific functions or specific programs. And that is reflected in our POM, Program Objective Memorandum. Then the budgeting phase, required funding for the upcoming fiscal year. That's the one where we submit no later than the first Monday in February. So for since we're in FY25, FY26 budget formulation and so forth would have started June last year. In order for the president to be able to submit it by February, that means you kind of have to backtrack, is they would have started like June last year so that when it gets to the president can submit it by February. And then execution is what happens after Congress appropriates the fund. And we touched a little bit on that in the first competency. All right, so let's do some check on learning. In the execution phase, what happens after Congress appropriates the funds? Two things happen right away. What is number one?
The treasury warrant?
Stay right there, you're there. The treasury warrant is issued. And that is a legal step because that you can tie to the law, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, that says the treasury you can't take any money out of the treasury unless you have an appropriation law in place. So once Congress appropriate the funds, the treasury issues the treasury warrant document. I think I have it later on in here again too. So you'll hear a lot of repeat. I'm not senile. I've done it long enough to know if in order for you to remember things that you don't deal with on a regular basis, you have to repeat it several times in different ways. All right, let's see. And then what's the second thing? The OMB so one side, Treasury Department will issue the treasury warrant. And then what does OMB do? That's the second step. What does OMB do after the appropriation is issued?
Portion?
Apportionment, okay? So the apportionment happens. OMB doesn't automatically send funding to the agencies, the Department of Defense. So Department of Defense have to fill out an SF-132 apportionment document and request their apportionment within 10 days of the appropriation law being enacted. And then OMB has 30 days to issue the apportionment. So what is it called when DOD takes their apportionment and then subdivide it to its subordinates? What is it called then? What does DOD do? So DOD issues allotments. So you have appropriation, which is done by Congress, apportionment, which is done by OMB, and allotment, which is issued by the agencies such as the Department of Defense. And for the CDFM, it's not like other exams where you study this and then you take the test and you like dump it. You're not going to be able to do that with the CDFM, because just like I'm pulling information from the first competency, is you're going to have to do the same thing. And the modules overlap. Module 1, 2, and 3, some of the same information is going to be in the others. So you can't just dump the information, in case you're wondering why I keep flipping back to other questions. All right, some terms you need to be familiar with and know how to do the calculation. Based on knowing the definition, you'll be able to figure it out. Turnover rate, as we're talking about, what is your turnover rate? That's the number of employees who left divided by the total number of positions you have in that organization. So for example, if they say, assume 10 people left within that fiscal year, you have 100 positions and 10 people left those positions, then your turnover rate will be 10%. Another term you need to be familiar with is the fill rate. That's the average number of days from when an employee leaves to the time you fill that position. And these terms were all in the older books. So I'm not going to go through each one. So you got lapse rate and the number of positions to budget. All right, so DoD separation incentives, there's still 2. The terms are a little bit different, I think, in the 2020 study guide, so listen carefully. All right, so you still have the buyout program, which is known as the Voluntary Separation Incentive Program, or VSIP, and DoD is permitted no more than 25,000 buyout separations per year. This is the same information in the older books. The purpose of these separation incentives, if you've been around, like some of us been around the government for a while, there was a time when they had too many people in the military, so they were paying people money to get out. So I know I've seen this buyout program in action, which you really don't make a lot, because they end up taxing a lot of it away from you anyway. So VSIP, 25,000 buyout separations a year. And then if you take the buyout under Title V U.S. Code, you cannot be reemployed in the organization for 12 months without Secretary of Defense approval. So if you took the money, for 12 months, you can't go back and work for the Department of Defense. Now, after that, yes, you can go back, but there's another stipulation that says if you are rehired within 5 years of separation, you have to pay the money back that you received. So that's why you always got to read the fine print. So pretty much they're saying for 5 years at least, you cannot go back and work for the government. Now, prior to 1 October 21, now this was a little bit different, I think, from the older book. Employees received the lesser of 40,000 or their severance pay. This expired FY22, and the current DoD limit is now back to 25,000. So in the 2020 book, I think it says that for the buyout program, that they receive the lesser of 40,000 or less. So 40,000 or less. If their severance pay is 50,000, they were only going to get 40,000. Well, that amount has dropped since FY22. It has now dropped to 25,000 is the limit. That's a big drop. And then you also have the early retirement program, which is called Voluntary Early Retirement, or VERA. So VSIP, which is the buyout, and VERA, which is early retirement, and it's exactly in its name. All right, mobilization and crisis management. So whenever there's a war or a natural disaster, and hey, we need more forces type of activity going on, you have to figure out the mobilization plan. So they can't wait until things happen to figure out, okay, what's the process for us to get more people? Just like when we had 9/11 and we had all these wars back to back, when it first happened, if anybody was around back then, remember it used to be only military personnel, soldiers or MPs that were on the gates, for instance, strictly on the gates. And then after 9/11, then you notice they started with contractors. And then I think eventually now they have GS personnel who check your ID cards when you come through the gate. So those were all because of mobilization and needing additional forces, because you need those MP soldiers to deploy, then someone has to pick up that mission. So the ability to transition from peacetime to wartime manning is crucial. Just like in our personal life, if something happens, an emergency happens, we have to have a plan in place so that the people know what to do while they're going through in their mind about that crisis. They also know, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that. So determine manpower requirements. You want to analyze your long range force readiness, deployment capability. So you got to look at all the requirements. How long is it going to take for me to get a unit from Fort Bragg, since we don't use Fort Bragg anymore, Fort Bragg, get them mobilized, then get them to Iraq? What is it going to take? So those questions have to be answered way in advance. So on that master mobilization plan is the process of how they assemble, how they organize and use your manpower resource to prepare for these emergencies. Just like laws and executive orders, or bills and executive orders, the president has some power. The president also has the authority to activate reserve forces, but there's only a few conditions where the president can activate forces without having to go to Congress. So the president can activate reserve forces if there's the use of or threatened use of weapons of mass destruction, or a terrorist attack or threatened terrorist attack. Those are the only two instances that the president can activate military personnel. He can order them into active duty for up to 365 days, no more than that. So he's limited to a year. So again, president can activate forces. Typically, if you look under the functions of Congress, Congress is the one who usually has to approve those things. But if it's a mass destruction of weapons of mass destruction issue or terrorist related, the president can activate reserve forces for up to 365 days. He's also limited that no more than 200,000 members of the selected reserve and the individual ready reserve can be placed on active duty at one time. And of that 200,000, no more than 30,000 can be IIR members, individual ready reserve. This is the same exact information that's in your older 2020 study guide. So there was nothing different here. Any questions so far? Because I'm also not manning the chat, so if you type in something in there, I can't see it. All right, two concepts relating to commercial activity. So commercial activity now is, we looked at getting civilian personnel. We talked about the military and strength, civilians, FTEs, full-time equivalent. Now we're gonna look at contractors. When do we determine that we need contractors? So there are two concepts you have to be familiar with: the term outsourcing versus privatization. So outsourcing simply means The government still maintains overall responsibility, but I can outsource certain pieces of the job, just like the dining facility. The government still owns the dining facility, but I can contract out the services in the dining facility. That's outsourcing. Privatization shifts the responsibility either in whole or partially from the government to the private sector. Who can give an example of a privatization action? Actually, on most installations, I think all, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't been to all, but privatization for family housing, military housing, that used to be run by government personnel. Now they have private companies and utility companies on the bases now, or posts. All right, so federal activities, Inventory Reform Act of 1998 says that no later than the end of the third quarter, each agency must submit to OMB a list of all activities performed by federal sources and those that are not inherently governmental. So this list is made public after review. So wherever you work, there's some of the functions that are done by contractors. So the Department of Defense has a requirement to provide an updated list, and I don't know how big the list is. I don't know if they look at DOD overwide. I can't give you the specifics on the list, but I know it includes all the functions performed by the federal in-house personnel versus those that are outsourced or done by a contractor. In 99% of what the government does with commercial activity is dealing with competition. Competition is required because you want to make sure that everything is fair and listed and competitive process to make a selection in who gets the contract. So you don't get caught up in, okay, well, that's my company and they got the contract. So earlier we talked about OMB Circular A11 when dealing with budget development, budget formulation and all of that. When it deals with commercial activity and going from contractor to in-house and in-house to contractor, the guidance from OMB comes from OMB Circular A76. So that's the second one you need to know. A11 and A76 deals with commercial activity. This guidance establishes the federal policies about how we are supposed to go about and determine our commercial activity process. So you need to know commercial activity are those goods or services that we get from a contractor. Inherently governmental are those functions performed only by federal or government employees. So a few terms you should already be familiar with: the PWS, or Performance Work Statement. That is the technical breakdown of what the job specific tasks are. And then you have the most efficient operation. I think in the older books it said most efficient organization, but it's the most efficient operation. That is the government. So you have to have a government in-house cost. What does it cost the government to do the job? And you also have the performance work statement, so you can get bids from contractors to do the same job. Has anyone ever participated in a study where they're trying to determine, where you have to sit down and you have to say, okay, when I come in on my computer, I turn my computer on and then I answer emails, I answer X amount of calls. Has anyone been familiar or participated in any of those? And would like to share? Go ahead.
I know for a period of time, it was about like a 1 month period of time, we were tracked every single thing that we did and how we did it, just to determine whether a contractor would be more appropriate for that, or a government person. So yes, I've participated in that.
Okay, outstanding. So some of us, yeah, and I've actually have done it a couple of times where exactly what she says, and you sometimes it makes you realize like, wow, I didn't realize I did all that, because now you're required to annotate it. But the purpose of that is to see how many man hours it takes, how much money it will cost to do the job, not what they pay us, but really, if you go to a contractor, they're going to go by the specific task that has to be accomplished, and that is how they bid on those contracts. All right. So the government policy is to achieve economy and enhance productivity, basically to be more efficient and retain government functions in-house, or if necessary, rely on the commercial sector. So the 876 competition process, going from government to private. First, a management study has to be done. And there's going to be a point where if it's going to impact a certain amount of DA civilians or Navy civilians or civilians in jobs, that they have to be notified. And you also have to notify Congress. And I'm going to look at that just shortly. So this management study has to be done to determine, okay, do we even, if it's cost efficient, do we even want to go through this process? But a standard competition timeline is usually about 12 months and can be extended for 18 months for the whole study to be completed. And if under streamlined procedures, they can take up to 90 days and extend it for an additional 45. So the example I gave earlier about the MP soldiers being on the gate way back before 9/11 is when that war kicked off and we had to all leave. Well, that was a streamlined process because they didn't have time to, we got to wait 18 months to get somebody on the gate. Is that then becomes a streamlined process that they had to push through real quickly. So streamlined process is used if the competition involves 65 FTE employees or less. Now, this is when Congress needs to be notified. Before you even do the study, DOD must notify Congress of intention to do a cost comparison involving 46 or more, that's 46 or more DOD FTE civilian personnel. And then notify the Undersecretary of Defense Personnel and Readiness, because they're in charge of manpower, of intent at least 5 working days before they notify Congress. So kind of give USD for personnel and readiness a heads up before Congress is notified. So that is, if you're doing a management study and it's going to impact 46 or more civilian positions, then Congress has to be notified and approve it before the study begins. And then once they approve it, then you can go through the study. DOD components must also tell the civilian employees who will be affected by the cost comparison. So whether they do anything with the information or not, once it's done, they still have to tell you up front. So the commercial bid, so when you do the MEO, most efficient organization, is the name of the government structure, and the performance work statement is used to get contractors to bid. The commercial bid must be at least 10% less than in-house personnel in order to be considered for use or for us to go to a contractor to do the job. So of course, remember there's always additional guidance, because again, if it's a wartime thing and this needs to happen now, it may not be 10% less. It may be, in most instances, it'll probably be higher than what I would normally pay because I'm in a bind. I need these people on ground now and so forth. And so in my notes, I did a diagram in the breakdown. of how the process continues. Also in this section, as stated, the fiscal law piece is now rolled up in all the different sections. And so there's an ethics piece in the manpower management. And I think there's a little bit in the older study guides also. We're going to switch gears from employees should not use public office for private gain. And that's nothing new. Gifts from outside sources. Can we accept gift from outside sources? Since this question always seems to come up for people.
It's my understanding where the value of the gift is $20 or less, not to exceed $50 annually.
Okay. So that is the exception to the policy, yes. But in most instances, you have to look and see, is that source prohibited? Does your company have a policy and says we cannot accept gifts? Is there a law? Is there a policy? So employees cannot take gifts from prohibited sources, such as organizations that are trying to do business with your organization or your agency. So if you know there's a company that's trying to get a contract with your organization, then you probably don't want to take a gift from them. So you have to look at from different angles. So it's true, the exception to the policy says that you may accept a gift from a contractor if the value is less to $20 or less and not to exceed $50 annually. And also if given on a, let's say, if a gift is given because I'm a family member or a personal friendship with that individual and they give me a gift, but the guidelines is still the same. Acceptance of gift by injured service members. So if a service member is injured, they can accept gifts up to $1,000. And then if it exceeds $1,000, then they must get a written determination if the gift can be accepted. So you get your ethics lawyers, the official one, not our personal lawyers. So you get a memorandum for record stating, yes, that they can accept that gift. So let's talk about gifts between employees. And in fiscal law, it talks about gifts that we give from subordinate, let's see, individual gifts to supervisors must not be more than how much? What's the total? When people come around and say, hey, so-and-so leaving, would you like to contribute? And if you say, yeah, I'd like to contribute, can I contribute $50 ethically?
No, I think it's no more than 10.
No more than 10. So $10 is the limit. And again, it's still by choice, voluntary basis. So DoD employee may not accept a gift from a donating group if the value of the gift exceeds $300. So the $10 limitation still applies. So if you have, so usually it's gifts between employees goes from your subordinates giving gifts to superiors or supervisors. There's no restriction on gifts from supervisors to subordinates. But again, you still got a perception, because if you're giving the same employee awards and gifts, then you give into the other ones. Now you open the door up for other problems. So if there's a conflict of interest, you may choose to do one of four things: recusal, not to participate, do a waiver. You can get a waiver from your agency, let them know exactly what you're doing, what type of activity it is, what's involved, and they can give you a waiver. Divestiture, divest or sell off your conflict of interest, or resign from whatever that conflict of interest is. So that's if you're in a position where conflict of interest is an issue with whoever you're interacting with on the contractor side. All right, let's talk about post-employment. So there are two restrictions for government employees involving specific parties they can work for. If the employee is personally involved with a company while working for the government, and that employee cannot leave the government and go and work directly for that same company. I think there's a 12-month timeline. I didn't see it in writing, but if I remember correctly, you have to wait, like a waiting period, even though we might see it. But if somebody wants to challenge it, you're not supposed to be working with a contractor. You're in the government capacity, working with a contractor, and you know the ins and outs of this agency. And now you turn around and go work for that contractor. Now you know their secrets, whatever it is, or how to work around things. So I think it's a 12-month wait before you can, let's see, there you go. Then employees is barred for 2 years after leaving government service. Oh yeah, there it is. If the matter was under employee's responsibility while working for the government, then an employee is barred for 2 years after leaving government service. And I think the older book says 1 year or 12 months. So make sure you understand you're barred for 2 years. Outside activity. So what we do outside of the workplace does matter. And it's this topic is very prevalent, as someone brought in some Girl Scout cookie sheets last week, is employees may engage in fundraising in personal capacity, but do not solicit funds from subordinates. Do not solicit money from personnel who have interests that may be affected by your organization. And do not use or permit the use of your official title or authority to promote a fundraising event. So if you're raising money for something, you don't have to go around and say, yeah, I work for the Forces Command in Fort Liberty, North Carolina. What does that got to do with Girl Scout cookie? So that's just an example. But is there any question? Because I think we are at the end, and I'm looking at the actual study guide. Make sure. Yeah, we are at the end. All right. So what questions do you have? Let's see, Mr. Jones, Roderick, go ahead, please.
Hey, good afternoon again, Helen. Is the Girl Scouts the only one that can actually solicit on an installation? Or are there other?
No, I don't say they can. I'm saying based on the fiscal law, really, we shouldn't be doing it. We should not. We shouldn't be selling nothing.
I thought at one time that there was something to where they were the only one that could do that.
Yeah, but I don't see anything in writing. If you find something, shoot it to me. Whether it's a policy letter or DOD directive or something that states that. But yeah, I have not seen anything. I know it's not in the study guides.
Okay, I'll just go to USO and get mine then.
No, that's all. Like,
Thank you.
We've been doing this. Yeah. All right. Any other question? That was a good question though, because I was like, yeah, that one comes around every year. But I have not seen an exception to the policy to accept that piece, because it's like once you open the door, what's the difference between accepting that event versus another event? So it may have been a local policy that they said, okay, it's all right, you can sell your cookies. All right, so we just, yes, sir, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that was it. That's all I had.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so we just went over CDFM Module 1, Competency 2, Manpower Management, as we look at how we develop and how we determine the right mix of personnel that is based off of the Department of Defense mission and requirements and the resources that are required. And in order to get the resources required, we have to put everything in the PPBE process that we use, which is that systematic process that we use to plan what needs to be done, program into and prioritize an individual category of programs of what needs to be done. Then we need to make sure that we meet that budgeting requirement for that upcoming fiscal year. And then we will execute the funds once the funds are received. What are your questions as it pertains to CDFM Module 1, Competency 2, Manpower Management? Okay, I don't hear any other questions, so we're going to close out for today. Again, notes for this session will be provided, and I will put the link in this meeting and also in the other areas on the Facebook and the LinkedIn and emails for those that are interested. And I will also upload the slides to the YouTube session later on today. All right, this concludes our session for today. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I'll see you guys again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.